Maybe we can move to the questions now to all the speakers, I guess, on all topics, all possible CGMES 3 topics.
We accept Sven as well. He joined us.
I know that there was one question from Jonas, but I think you solved that.
I think I covered that one, yeah.
Let us know, Jonas, if you think it was solved. Yeah, that's covered. Okay. Then just to go one by one, we had also Thomas. Measurement can measurement be associated to a power system resource?
Sven has responded.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you have one question for Miguel and another for Tanya. For Miguel, that's the question from Mahmoud. He wonders if software developers should implement the shackle/OCL constraints in the software that reports SIM or deal with equipment basis. From your experience, is it the recommended way?
First of all, CGMES is not a relational model. Is the first question. So that means that you have a structural model, and the community that is in charge of the definition of the standard the responsible that should define the rules. The good idea with Shackle is that there is a complete transparency between what is defined by the law. Let me say the people that are defining the rules and the people that are going to consume. So that means that and the behind the databases, that is, I understand one of the reasons of the question. If you want to be compliant with the rules and you have decided to implement CGMES with an internal database, to comply with them, you need to be careful about what are the different relations between tables, the foreign keys, and so on, in order to have to be compliant with that. But there are many other ways to implement CGMES. You can use graph databases and so on for implementing the standard. For the case of the OCL, you need an OCL interpreter. That means that finally you need to be able to run the OCL expressions over the data sets. But concerning to the question itself, I think that if the rules are defined in Shackle, you don't need to be careful about how you are going to run the rules, because only what you need to do is to use a Shackle engine or what we call a Shackle interpreter to run the rules. And in order to comply with that, what you need to do, if you have decided to use relational databases, to be careful about how the tables are linked each other, and to be careful with that, because at the end, when you are going to serialize the model itself, what you are going to do is to perform a query to the database, to walk through all the tables, and finally to write down on a file what you are going to serialize. And depending on how it is the design of this database design, you could have problems with the implementation of the standard. That is my final answer to that. I expect that I have answered to your question.
Please let us know, Mahmoud, if that was answered. But you had also another question for Tanya, which is in fact that she mentioned file headers, and that in a file I can refer to an UUID in a file. If I understand that correctly, can I refer to an UID instance defined in another file? Where can I read more about this part?
So I'll give the general answer, and then Chavdar, maybe you want to complement me. You should read 552, so 61970-552, which defines how we serialize our profiles, so how we serialize data, which tells that what you are looking in UML is association. So if you follow that link, that association actually points from one place where you are, for instance, file B, to an instance which may be in file A. Okay, and if it is defined in file A, then you point only just to the UUID, which you will find in another file. You may comment, Chavdar, maybe about validation, dangling references, and such.
Yeah, so that for validation, it's important that if you have a rule that requires your data to be complete, obviously you will need to collect all the dependencies and all the references before you validate the data. Otherwise, you will get a dangling references. So pieces that you have an instruction that you need to find that ID, but that ID is not completed in the data, in the scope of the data that you imported. And of course, validation cannot be completed.
So in principle, you have in your header the first reference or set of references to all the dependent files. Like when you program, if you have include or import or something like this. So that's what tells you all data which is required in principle. And if you consider that these are imported somehow one way or the other in your application, the reference should be there, imported there. So you can refer anything, any object defined in declared, created, in fact, in other dependent files.
Maybe a little bit to add also on the previous question for the Shako-Watsio. Maybe if you meant that, is it required that the developers are implementing inside the Shako? I would say that's more internal business for how developers are approaching that. So how they would guarantee that their export will meet the necessary requirements of the data exchange. And they may select to implement some of those rules internally, so before the data is exported, but there could be other workflows. So that depends on environment, depends on many things. But certainly for some implementation could be an option. And that's why we also have the conformity, because the conformity looks at the output, but then how you get to that output, it's an implementation task.
Just to comment on that, for the case of the validation against RDF schema, in the world of ontologies, this is very complex to be able to compliant with RDF schema, because what is validation against the RDF schema is to be able to be compliant with all the names on the classes that we are using are defined on the RDF schema. The inheritance is defined with all the, let me say, the parents and the childs that are defined on the RDF schema, the data types, and so on and so on. And finally, what is behind of that is an ontology, and in that case, the people that is in charge of ontology, they say that this is an open world assumption. That means that everything that is not on the model is valid, that is not on the RDF schema. So finally, what shackle rules are doing is to constrain the data that you can use, because the paradigm does not provide you, unless you use shackle, a mechanism to validate your model against the RDF schema. In the same way that you validate an XML file against the XML schema, that is a validation against the structural model. In the case of RDF, the unique mechanism that you can use to do that is use shackle. So that means that when you build your instances regarding to RDF schema in order to make sure that your instances are valid against your model. The idea is to use shackle because otherwise to check the the existence of an instance, if the existence of a parameter, if they trying to cross-check a parameter with another instance and so on, the more complex validations that you can imagine, you only can do it with using SACL.
Do we have more questions?
I think that they were answered by Svein. So yeah, I guess that you can, of course, make more questions now, but the ones in the chat, they should have been already answered.
So maybe we can ask the question, what is your challenge in understanding the CGMS? So what is the thing needs to be described more, or what is the thing needs to be getting training more on? So if somebody wants to comment on that or to have some more interaction.
Yeah, don't be shy.
Since the no question, it means it's perfect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I think it is with cycling. You need to go on the bike and start cycling. It's the only way to learn how to cycle. So that is definitely a recommendation. And then emphasize that all of this, we have examples. We have multiple examples on the SharePoint side with Sim 17. And looking through those examples should help a lot. Obviously, what we will try is to try to explain them better, so we get more description on things, but in general, that should give a very good insight.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a question from Santiago here on the interpretation, and I guess what you mean is maybe unique interpretation of meaning of classes and attributes and usage most probably, and that's really a challenge, and that's why we say always use the last version, because the community is learning and the new feedback is received and integrated in the newer releases. So you cannot ask really work with Sim 10 or whatever and try to understand something, what the interpretation was in that time, and then having a new version now, Sim 17, where the things are maybe much better described. But one of the challenge that the community has is that SIM as a common information model, it's covering lots of business cases, a lot of use cases, and sometimes it's hard to nail down the things, but we are getting there, I think, but it needs time. And the constraints that Miguel was mentioning are then also defining a little bit, tightening the usage maybe for a given business process, especially if we have the business constraints on top of the regular profiles. But yes, when you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think is spot on. I think so. It's always, if it's problem interpretation, go to the latest version. And in our IOP, we've done quite a few, Chandra and myself, and we are very surprised on how different things, one sentence could be interpreted. We've been in a meeting and the three vendors the same sentence interpreted it like three different ways. Some of the challenges that we then put the interpretation in multiple places, but that is also dangerous because when we do update, we may not be able to update all of the places. So that's what a lot of places we just try to write it once. And the big thing now when we move to, because there's so much bigger community that is implementing CGMS 2.4, we did a bit of learning, and that's why we had tried to make everything machine readable, or actually not just machine readable, in machine interpretable. And with machine interpretation, there shouldn't be any kind of duplication in interpretation in general for the one we have described. So that is, and that's one of the big advantage going to the CGMS 3. That is, but there is always probably stuff that we haven't done good enough, and ENTSO-E will then gonna have a GitHub set up that we can do more interaction with this type of questions.
Yeah, and maybe good to mention that, yes, ENTSO-E was facilitating the development and making sure that people were well informed, but at the end, that's an international IC standard, and which is voted by all the national committees in the world. So everybody in its own country can actually contribute and make sure that next versions of the standards are getting better and better, and artifacts are published on the right place. But there are also some other questions here, I see.
Hi, I'm Santiago. I just would like very quickly to mention something.
Sure.
So last year on I think on December, we contacted ERCOT, so that's the operator from Texas, to ask them how they did it, because apparently they implemented SIM in a very successful way. And the take-home message from that meeting, which Miguel was there with me as well, was we made our own SIM and the world needs to comply with it. So they took SIM and they say now it's sim.ercot, and everyone talking to ERCOT needs to use this particular version. And in that way, they turn SIM into something really useful and operational. On the contrary, if I am Red Electrica, I'm hoping to get anything from anyone, that's very challenging. Talking with Miguel now with these SACL rules and everything, hopefully things get easier, but still the open world thing is very challenging if you want something useful.
Yes, Sven?
Yeah, I can answer. So I worked quite a lot, or we have worked quite a lot with the people responsible in ERCOT. And this is also what's happening a little bit now with the network code that we're doing in ENTSO-E. And that's a little bit the way the development of the standard is happening. That means that ERCOT, I can't remember exactly which version of SIM they did, but they maybe a 10 they started with. Yeah, and then they developed everything that they needed, but not necessarily going out and asking whole community and everywhere to make sure that it fitted them, because you don't have the time to do that. And from that part, there's been adapted the stuff that was thought to be a general need, that fits everybody. So that becomes being in the next version of SIM being published. The stuff that is not quite standardized has kind of been left. And the same thing now when we're going to come in ENTSO-E, we're going to come up with an extension that is meeting the requirement we have in Europe. And then the next step, we'll try to make sure that that's coordinated with all the rest of the world to see how we can make sure it will fit everywhere. But that means that what is standardized should be standardized, but there will be need for having some extension and things, because there's no point implementing a standard if you can't meet all your requirement.
Yeah, this is Pat Brown. I'd like to point out, and this occurred during a gap in the time that I was working on the common information model. But in my understanding, something like, good heavens, 80 to 90% of the extensions that ENTSO-E put in got wrapped back in to subsequent versions of the SIM. And that is just what do I want to say? That is the archetypal way that implementations help move the SIM forward. The SIM can't anticipate every business case, as Chapter says, that's out there. And every implementation is going to need to do extensions. And I think there's always I want to say this, a judgment call that needs to be made on every project about how much you want the work that you're doing to extend the SIM to have a probability of success of actually making it into the standard. And if that's really important, then you slow the project down a little bit and you work with the SIM working groups to be sure that that you're taking requirements into account that perhaps are beyond your own. On the other hand, most projects, have timelines that need to get done. And so you do the best you can do. You have as many conversations as you have, but, at some time you just got to cut bait and fish. You just got to go, kind of go do it. And then communicate back with the SIM community to see if your use cases can be pulled into the conversations that are going on in the working groups.
I would add to this that every project so far that I know also defines some kind of implementation guide or guideline on how to use certain parts of which are really specific to the project. And that is part also of how to ensure that everybody interprets things in the same way for a given project, or how to constrain something if something is generic for the given case.
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of have this picture of a data exchange environments in my head, and every one of those data exchange environments, which you could sort of think of as an implementation, they have their collection of rules, and they're not just profiles or not just the underlying information model. They're also population rules, right? A lot of that stuff that Shackle can help enforce. And so, yeah, very much the exact same profile can be used to implement in lots of different implementations, but those population guidelines, modeling rules, whatever you want to call it, are going to differ from one to the next. So totally with you, Chania.
So like, are you going to model your transformer, your 3-winding transformer, for instance, so as 3 2-winding or as 1 3-winding? So there may be limitations in a given context. Maybe you want to reinforce something. In another context, you say, I don't care, I support both. So, but the profiles allow you to model both. And it's going to depend on context, how interoperable it's going to be. And we also expect, to an extent, from tools for certain things to support actually those facets. I mean, reasonable amount of course, not now wild ideas, but because the standard supports it.
So do we have other?
Yeah, I was tending to tell to, I think, Mahmoud to talk to his software engineering colleague or to hire a software developer, because that's what they know about, is their business. Those technologies tend to get a little bit of help from.
Yeah, you need to be a team, and that's what I tried to say in the answer here. It's the same difficulty looking from an IT perspective, that made the people that know Shackle and XML, and they wouldn't understand what a state estimator is or a power flow is. So there is a team effort, and SIM is trying to help to move those worlds together, but definitely not explaining all it. So you need to rely on standard or documents that describing power flow and state estimator for those IT people to understand it. And in the same way, we are trying to move on use standards that exist out there, and we can link to them, and where you can find all the documents. So we're not inventing kind of technical IT standards ourselves. However, we've been a pioneer. So we were one of the original project referring to the semantic web standards. So that is always a challenge.
Regarding to Santiago comments, I would include I understand that the data in each case is standing from their legacy system, and unless you have, let me say, a theme-based data storage inside the company, you at the end need to make some, let me say, alignment process and mapping tables and way to convert. And I think that regarding to Santiago comments, I think that from the point of view of modeling, we should have a less a reduced way to do some conversion from our legacy system to the CGMES model. No, if you open the range on how many models you can build to model the same element in the power system, you are opening to, let me say, to not be interoperable. No, at the end, unless you build many modeling guidelines, at the end, it's if you try to reduce as much as possible how to build the main building blocks in CGMS from the legacy system, you are closing what is expected from your side to do with the conversion. No, and I think that this is one of the claims from Santiago, that this is with some wide spectrum, no, to do that what is defined by CGMS standard.
Thank you for today, for your interventions, and also for your attention for the audience. See you in the next one.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay,
Have a nice
bye-bye.
day. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.